It was a bitter winter night, and the wind howled through the empty streets of the city. Snow piled up in white mounds, blanketing everything in silence. Edward Sterling, a reclusive millionaire known for his cold demeanor and unsympathetic business tactics, hurried down the street toward his mansion on the hill. He had no intention of getting involved in anything that might delay his return home. But that night, fate had other plans. Just outside the wrought iron gates of his grand estate, he found a small, ragged figure lying motionless in the snow, a young beggar, no more than 10 years old, barely breathing. Edward's heart, hardened over the years, stirred with something unfamiliar. He could not walk away. Title: A millionaire found a little beggar fainted in the snow and took him to his mansion. However, when he returned from work, he broke down in tears upon seeing what the boy had done to his disabled wife. Edward carried the unconscious boy into his mansion, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The warmth of the grand foyer enveloped him, the contrast from the icy outdoors almost shocking. He laid the boy gently on the plush velvet couch by the roaring fireplace, taking a deep breath as he called for his housekeeper, Mrs. Watkins, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude. She came bustling in, her expression turning to one of surprise as she saw the boy. "Mr. Sterling, what is this?" she asked, her eyes flickering between the child and her employer. "I found him outside, near the gate," Edward said, his voice quieter than usual. "He's freezing, Mrs. Watkins. Help him." Mrs. Watkins gave him a look but did as she was told. She fetched blankets and hot water, tending to the boy with surprising tenderness. As they worked to revive him, Edward's mind raced. He hadn't cared for anyone outside of his wife in years. Amelia, his beloved, once vibrant wife, had been in a wheelchair since the accident 5 years ago. She was the only person who softened his steely exterior. But since her injury, Edward had thrown himself into work, becoming cold and withdrawn. That night, something inside him cracked open. The boy slowly regained consciousness, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze darted around the grand room, wide with fear. "Where am I?" he whispered. "You're safe," Edward said, standing at a distance, unsure of how to handle the situation. "My name is Tom," the boy mumbled, shivering under the blankets. Mrs. Watkins served him a bowl of warm soup, and the boy, ravenous, ate it quickly. Edward watched, conflicted. He wasn't sure why he had brought this child into his home, a place so far removed from the boy's world of poverty and struggle. Tom was small, malnourished, and clearly alone in the world. As the hours passed, Edward learned that the boy had no family, no place to call home. He had been surviving on the streets, scavenging for food and shelter wherever he could find it. "Thank you, sir, for helping me," Tom said, his voice barely audible. Edward nodded but said nothing. He could not explain it, but he felt something pulling him toward this boy, something beyond charity or pity. Still, he was hesitant, unsure of what to do next. Days passed, and Tom recovered his strength, much to the concern of Mrs. Watkins, who wondered why Edward was keeping him there. She knew her employer's icy temperament and suspected this charity was temporary, yet something told her that this time, it was different. Amelia Sterling, Edward's wife, remained unaware of the boy's presence for the first few days. Confined to her wing of the mansion due to her disability, she rarely interacted with the household staff or her husband beyond a few routine exchanges. Edward spent most of his time at work or in his study, leaving Amelia in the care of her nurse. She had once been a lively and artistic woman, but the accident had dimmed her spirit, leaving her a shadow of the person she used to be. Edward blamed himself for her condition, though neither of them spoke of it. One evening, Tom wandered into Amelia's wing. He had been exploring the mansion's endless hallways, marveling at its grandeur. When he opened the door to her room, Amelia was sitting by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered garden. Startled, she turned her wheelchair toward the door. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "I'm Tom," the boy said nervously, stepping into the room. "Mr. Sterling found me outside." Amelia's eyes softened. "Come closer," she said, beckoning him with a gentle wave of her hand. Tom hesitated but obeyed, walking over to the chair beside her. They spoke for a while, Tom sharing bits and pieces of his life on the streets, and Amelia listening with a quiet sadness. She found herself drawn to the boy's honesty, his resilience. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of life, a connection to something beyond her own pain. From that day on, Tom and Amelia grew close. He spent his mornings with her, reading to her or simply talking, while Edward was away at work. Amelia, in turn, became like a mother to him, offering the warmth and affection he had been missing for so long. The mansion, once a place of silence and isolation, began to fill with laughter, something Edward noticed with unease. At first, Edward was pleased to see his wife smile again. But as the bond between Amelia and Tom grew stronger, he began to feel a pang of jealousy. He had worked tirelessly to care for her, yet he could never bring her the joy that this boy seemed to provide so effortlessly. The thought gnawed at him, though he said nothing. Weeks passed, and Tom's presence in the mansion became a fixture. Mrs. Watkins had even warmed to the boy, though she kept a watchful eye on him. Edward, however, became increasingly conflicted. On the one hand, he was grateful for the happiness Tom brought to Amelia. On the other, he felt an ever-growing sense of unease. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Edward returned home to find the house eerily quiet. He called out for Mrs. Watkins, but there was no response. His footsteps echoed through the long corridors as he made his way to Amelia's room. As he opened the door, the scene that greeted him made his heart stop. Amelia's wheelchair was overturned, and she lay on the floor, motionless. Tom was kneeling beside her, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," Tom cried, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean to." Edward rushed to his wife's side, his hands trembling as he lifted her into his arms. She was unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Rage surged through him as he turned to the boy, his voice a low growl. "What have you done?" he demanded. Tom sobbed, unable to form coherent words. She. Mrs. Watkins appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "Mr. Sterling, I heard a crash. Call the doctor." Edward shouted, his voice filled with desperation. The doctor arrived quickly and tended to Amelia, but the prognosis was grim. She had suffered a severe head injury, and there was no telling when, or if, she would wake up. Edward's world collapsed. He retreated into himself, consumed by guilt and anger. He blamed Tom for what had happened, though the boy insisted it was an accident. Edward refused to listen, his heart hardened once more. The days that followed were tense and unbearable. Tom, now a shadow of the lively boy he once was, kept to himself, overwhelmed with guilt. He replayed the events of that night in his mind over and over again. He had only been trying to help Amelia, to cheer her up, but something had gone terribly wrong. She had leaned forward in her wheelchair, trying to reach something, and he had tried to assist her. In a moment of panic, the chair had tipped over, and she had fallen. Edward, however, refused to believe it was an accident. The loss of his wife's consciousness, her fragile state, was too much for him to bear. He lashed out, blaming Tom for everything. Mrs. Watkins tried to reason with him, but he was inconsolable. One night, Edward sat in his study, staring at the fire, his mind consumed by dark thoughts. He thought of sending Tom away, back to the streets where he had come from. But as he looked at a portrait of Amelia on the wall, he hesitated. She had loved the boy. She had found joy in him, something Edward could not ignore. Then, something unexpected happened. Amelia woke up. It was slow at first, just a flicker of her eyelids. But within days, she regained full consciousness, though she was weak and disoriented. Edward was overjoyed, but his relief quickly turned to sorrow when he saw the distant look in her eyes. She remembered the accident, but more importantly, she remembered Tom. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Edward clenched his fists, struggling to find the words. "He's gone," he lied, unable to face the boy or his wife's affection for him. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "You sent him away, didn't you?" Edward's silence was answer enough. Amelia's recovery was slow, but she never stopped asking about Tom. Edward, weighed down by guilt, finally admitted the truth. He had been wrong to blame the boy. It was not Tom's fault, he had only tried to help. With Amelia's encouragement, Edward went searching for Tom. He scoured the city, the streets where he had once found the boy. After days of searching, he finally found him in an alley, cold and alone, just as he had been that first night. Edward knelt beside him, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Tom. I was wrong." Tom looked up at him, his eyes filled with hurt and confusion. "Why did you send me away?" Edward's heart ached. "I was angry. I couldn't think straight. But Amelia, she wants to see you. She needs you." Tom hesitated, but eventually, he stood and followed Edward back to the mansion. When they arrived, Amelia was waiting for them, her face pale but her smile warm. She reached out to Tom, and the boy ran to her, burying his face in her lap. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You have nothing to apologize for," Amelia said softly, stroking his hair. "You saved me, Tom, in more ways than one." Edward watched, his heart heavy with regret, but also with a newfound sense of hope. The boy who had once been a stranger had brought something precious back into their lives: love, forgiveness, and the chance for redemption. And in that moment, Edward realized that he, too, had been saved. The end. Title: The shocking moment a millionaire gave his house to a beggar in the rain. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain poured relentlessly and the streets became rivers. James Westwood, a reclusive millionaire, was on his way to the airport for a long overdue vacation. But as he drove through the city's dimly lit streets, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A woman, drenched and holding a baby, stood shivering in the rain. She had nothing but a soaked blanket wrapped around her child. Without thinking twice, James did the unimaginable. He handed her the keys to his mansion. But what he found upon his return left him utterly speechless. James Westwood was a man whose life had been shaped by wealth and solitude. He had earned his fortune through a series of savvy investments in real estate, technology, and the stock market. Despite his success, his wealth had come at a cost. He lived alone in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by luxury but haunted by loneliness. His closest companions were the cold marble floors and towering walls of his home, a place more like a fortress than a residence. The lavish furniture, the priceless art, none of it filled the emptiness inside him. He had once been married, but his wife, Eleanor, had left him years ago. They had no children, and since her departure, James had shut himself off from the world. He poured himself into his work, into the relentless pursuit of more money, more success. But deep down, he knew he was miserable. On this particular night, James was headed to the airport. He had finally decided to take a break from his work and fly to Europe, hoping that perhaps a change of scenery might bring him the peace he so desperately needed. The storm that raged outside reflected the turmoil inside him, an emptiness he couldn't quite explain. As he drove through the rain-soaked streets, James's mind drifted to the past. He thought about how his life had taken such a strange turn, how he had pushed away everyone who had ever cared about him. He didn't notice at first the figure standing by the side of the road. But as his headlights illuminated the scene, he saw her, a woman, drenched from head to toe, holding a baby in her arms. The woman's clothes clung to her frail body, and the baby, wrapped in a thin, soaked blanket, shivered in her embrace. James's foot instinctively hit the brakes, bringing his car to a sudden halt. He stared at the woman through the windshield, his heart pounding. Why was she out in the storm with a baby? Where could she possibly be going in weather like this? He rolled down the window slightly, and the cold, wet wind rushed into the car. The woman approached cautiously, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please, my baby, we have nowhere to go," she whispered, barely audible over the sound of the rain. James was at a loss for words. He had never been the kind of man who stopped to help strangers. But something about this woman, something about the helplessness in her voice and the vulnerability in her eyes, struck him deeply. He didn't think. He just acted. "Get in the car," he said, unlocking the door. The woman hesitated for a moment, then quickly opened the door and climbed in, clutching her baby tightly. James sat in silence for a moment, staring at the woman. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, and the baby looked even worse. The child's tiny face was pale, and its lips were blue from the cold. "Where are you going?" James asked, though he doubted she had a destination. I don't know," the woman stammered. "We've been on the streets for days. I don't know where else to go." James glanced out the window at the rain. He couldn't just leave them out here, not in this weather. "Look," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the key to his mansion. "Take this. It's the key to my house. It's just down the road. You'll find food, blankets, everything you need. You can stay there until you figure things out." The woman stared at him in shock, her mouth slightly open. I can't." "Take it," James insisted. "It's the least I can do." With trembling hands, the woman took the key from him. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." James nodded curtly. "It's fine. Just go before the storm gets worse." She climbed out of the car and hurried down the street toward his mansion, the baby still clutched to her chest. James watched her disappear into the rain before driving away, his mind swirling with confusion. What had he just done? He had given a complete stranger the keys to his house. But as bizarre as it seemed, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, James felt like he had done something that mattered. James arrived at the airport and boarded his flight, still thinking about the woman and the baby. He couldn't shake the image of her standing in the rain, the look of desperation in her eyes. As the plane took off and soared into the sky, he told himself that he had done the right thing. After all, he had more than enough. What harm could come from letting her stay in his house for a night or two? But as the days passed, something gnawed at him. He couldn't get her out of his mind. He wondered who she was, where she had come from, and most importantly, what she was doing now. Was she still in his house? Had she left already? And why had she been out in the rain with a baby in the first place? By the end of his trip, James was consumed by these thoughts. He cut his vacation short and booked an early flight home. Something told him that he needed to return. He had to know what had happened after he left that night. When he finally arrived back in the city, James drove straight to his mansion. As he pulled up to the front gates, something seemed off. The air felt heavy with tension, and the house loomed in front of him like a dark, brooding figure. The gates were open, which was strange. He always kept them locked. He parked the car and approached the front door, his heart racing. The key was still in the lock. Slowly, he turned it and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him was nothing short of shocking. His once pristine home was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, the marble floors were scratched and dirty, and the artwork on the walls was torn and defaced. It looked like a hurricane had blown through the house. But what stunned him most was the sound coming from upstairs, the soft, melodic sound of a piano. James's blood ran cold. He didn't own a piano. He walked up the grand staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the second floor, he followed the sound of the music until he found himself standing in front of the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. With a deep breath, James pushed the door open. Inside, sitting at an old, dusty piano that James had never seen before, was the woman from that stormy night. She was no longer wearing the ragged clothes from before. Instead, she was dressed in a long, flowing gown that shimmered in the dim light of the room. The baby was nowhere to be seen. She didn't look up as James entered. Her fingers glided over the keys with grace and precision, playing a haunting melody that filled the room with an eerie sense of calm. "Who are you?" James finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stopped playing and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of something in her eyes, something unsettling. "I told you," she said softly, "I had nowhere to go." James stared at her, his mind racing. None of this made any sense. How had his house fallen into such chaos? And where was the baby? Before he could ask another question, the woman stood up and walked toward him, her movements slow and deliberate. James instinctively took a step back. "You did a kind thing that night," she said, her voice carrying a strange, hypnotic quality. "But kindness often comes with consequences." "What do you mean?" James asked, his throat dry. The woman smiled, a smile that sent chills down his spine. "This house, it belongs to me now." James blinked in confusion. What are you talking about? This is my house. The woman shook her head slowly. No. You gave it to me. When you handed me that key, you gave me more than just shelter, you gave me ownership. James's heart pounded in his chest. That's ridiculous. I was just trying to help you. You can't just. You gave me your house, she repeated, her voice cold and unyielding. And now, it's mine. James felt his legs go weak as the weight of her words sank in. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. No one could just take ownership of a house like that. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that terrified him. It wasn't just a woman standing before him, it was something far more dangerous, something otherworldly. I don't know who you think you are, James said, his voice shaking with anger, but you need to leave. Now. The woman's smile widened. I'm afraid it's too late for that. Suddenly, the room around him began to change. The walls seemed to ripple like water, the floor shifting beneath his feet. The once elegant mansion was transforming into something dark and twisted, the beautiful furnishings turning into grotesque, decaying shadows of their former selves. James stumbled backward, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. What are you doing? The woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. You see, James, you didn't just give me your house. You gave me your soul. James's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the true horror of the situation. This woman, this creature, wasn't human. She was something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for an opportunity to claim him. And he had given it to her. You can't do this, James whispered, his voice filled with desperation. I didn't know. I didn't know. The woman laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like the wind through a graveyard. Ignorance is no excuse. You made a choice, James. And now, you must live with the consequences. James felt a wave of despair wash over him as the reality of his situation became clear. He had been tricked, lured into a trap by his own kindness. The house, the life he had built, was no longer his. It belonged to her. And there was nothing he could do to change that. The woman turned and walked back to the piano, her fingers once again dancing over the keys. The haunting melody filled the room, wrapping around James like a suffocating embrace. As he stood there, powerless and broken, James realized the true cost of his actions. In trying to do something good, he had lost everything. The woman had taken not just his house, but his very soul. And there was no escape. As the music played on, James sank to the floor, the weight of his choices crushing him. He had made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. And now, he would pay for it for eternity. The end.